Hello, everybody, and welcome to Unit 3. We're looking at violence at the macro level now. So we've looked at micro, we've looked at meso, and now we're looking at macro. This unit is probably my favorite unit. A lot of the work I do deals with violence at a macro level, and so I'm really excited to teach it to you guys, and I think it's very timely with a lot of the holidays coming up. So let's dig right in. So as always, I'm going to give you guys a little reminders about the course. Remember that violence is the whole or partial negation of agency through force. And again, force doesn't always mean physical. Agency or autonomy is removed through dehumanization and demonization. Violence has increased as the West has colonized. Violence is about power. Those who have power want to keep it, and those who don't have power want to get it. Violence can be viewed as an acceptable way of obtaining or maintaining power. Violence creates a dichotomy of us versus them, and remember who is commonly in each group in this country. And finally, our perception of violence is context dependent. We perceive violence as quote-unquote justified or appropriate based on who is committing it and what it is being used for, and this overlaps with the us versus them dichotomy in this country. Also, I apologize if you hear random noises in the background. My partner's doing some house cleaning in the back. I'm at home, so my apologies in advance. Remember that this course works with two models, one of which is a modified Bronfenbrenner model. Now in Unit 1, we looked at behaviors that mainly occurred in this micro level, and I'm not an artist, so I apologize for all these scribbles. In Unit 2, we discussed behaviors that mainly occur within a meso or group level. Now in Unit 3, we're moving to the outermost level, looking at behaviors that occur on a system or institution-wide scale, and I apologize for the terrible graphics. So in this case, we're looking at correctional facilities, as an institution, the prison industrial complex. We're looking at law enforcement as a whole. We're looking at the U.S. court system. So really on a nationwide or geographical region-wide scale. Now, for this course, macrosystemic violence is pretty similar to mesosystemic violence in that it looks at violence between groups. We're not really looking at individual acts of violence, although individuals might carry out those acts of violence, they're done on behalf of a group. However, the scale of violence in the macro system is going to be much larger. So instead of looking at gangs, which might be, if they're like local gangs, a handful of people to, a couple dozen people, now we're looking at things like war, which is between nations, millions of people. So we're taking it and we're bringing it to a much broader scale. Now, remember that the modified Bronfenbrenner model looks at ecological levels in which behaviors occur, and the violence pyramid, looks at those behaviors. If you need a reminder of these explanations of the tier of the pyramid, take a look at the Unit 1 and context slides. Now, remember some important things to remember about this pyramid is that the lines between the levels, so let me get a different color here. What you see here, they're not hard lines, they're dotted lines really. A person's behavior may not be categorized as only attitudes and beliefs or only acts of prejudice. They might be both, they might be on a continuum. It's also important to remember that while lower tier behaviors do not always lead to upper tier behaviors almost always occur because lower tier behaviors were viewed as okay, they were normalized. Now in Unit 3, we are looking at middle to top levels of the pyramid. We're looking at discrimination, we're looking at violent acts, and we're looking at war and genocide. Now remember that these acts are supported by acts of prejudice. They're supported by attitudes and beliefs. And so we've looked at those bottom levels of the pyramid, and now we're looking at the top levels. Remember too that while the top levels, may not be as common, they're much more serious and they have much broader impact. So like, if you have implicit bias against black people, so to speak, and, you just have that bias, you don't do anything about it, it's not going to have as much of an impact as if you, decided to start the transatlantic slave trade like Christopher Columbus did. So again, fewer actions, larger impact. Now, as I mentioned earlier, macro level violence is similar to meso level violence in that it generally occurs between groups. Now, what differentiates macro level from meso level violence is the group size or level of power. And so in macro level violence, the group or groups committing the violence have much more power relative to the group or groups at the receiving end of violence. Now, this violence is coordinated among large organizations, so states or nations, armies, large social movements. And I have an optional movement on social movements in 2 weeks that you're welcome to look at. Now, while macro level processes are full of micro level behaviors, so they could be individual behaviors, there are distinctive patterns that connect these sort of individual acts into larger ones. And so in macro level violence, the behavior of the group consists of the sum of the behaviors of its members. Leaders of these groups, train individual agents, like the army trains its individual soldiers. And so these individual soldiers or these individual people in this group are acting on behalf of the larger group, not on their own, so to speak. Now, throughout much of this course, and I clicked this a little early, we haven't really talked about the legality of violence. And I purposefully avoid this discussion because I don't find it generally relevant to this course. You have other courses where you talk about the legality of behaviors. This is a criminology program. But I want to point out here that a lot of the violence that we've talked about throughout this course is viewed as illegal. So, straight up assault, generally viewed as illegal. Gang activity viewed as illegal, largely because that violence has been perpetrated by those without power, or those without, with some small level of power. Now, while there are definitely laws regarding war crimes and human rights laws, things like structural violence, war, and genocide are not illegal, and in fact, are pretty common throughout our history. So if we think about how this relates to power, who is responsible for macro level violence and what level of power do they have? Now, another reason people successfully carry out this kind of violence is because they react to criticism by deflecting attention away from them. Think about who's in charge of this country and how they respond to criticism. Think about how they act on Twitter. Think about war propaganda or gentrification. The purpose of this of war, of gentrification, of other macro level violence is to supposedly improve the lives of the them group, because the them group can't do it themselves. And so if you start this process on a smaller scale, if you have implicit biases and negative social attitudes regarding the them group, then it becomes easy to turn attention away from systemic violence. And we're going to talk about that more in the next couple weeks as we really talk about the different types of macro level violence. But in my slide notes, I have a few resources you're welcome to take a look at in addition to the readings. So let's take a look at what's in this unit. So thinking back to the violence pyramid, violent behaviors that we see at this level are mid to high tier, which suggests that these behaviors are less common, but much more severe than their lower tier counterpoints. And so in this unit, we'll look at structural violence, we'll look at discrimination, then we'll look at war and genocide, which, is very comfy, cozy. And I end up timing it pretty well that we always look at war and genocide right around Thanksgiving. And I don't intentionally do it to ruin your Thanksgiving, but it's maybe not so unfortunate side effect. So we'll talk about that right around Thanksgiving. As a heads up, just in case people need to know, I've generally stayed away from particularly gruesome imagery and description because I don't really feel it's necessary to get my point across. I don't need, poverty porn to get my point across. But war and genocide is gruesome and horrifying, and so as such, I'm giving a general content warning now, and I'll try to give content warnings for specific things in class in the future. The bottom there, that link is a TED Talk that I want you to watch, talking about what happens after war. For those of you doing structural violence or war level PSAs, this would be really helpful for you, so I encourage you to watch this. There should be transcripts if you need closed captioning. I can also put it on the YouTube playlist, which I'm severely behind on, and I apologize if you are so interested. So this is a pretty short introduction to Unit 3. I think most people get structural violence pretty well. which is part of the reason why it's my favorite to teach, because now we're kind of putting everything together and seeing how those smaller level actions build up to big things. So class activity 7 will be released on Blackboard at 11 a.m. on Thursday, and you'll have until 11 a.m. on Friday to complete it. It's going to be the same as the other 2 online class activities. Now, I want to give a heads up, and I'll send another announcement about this. Next week, I'm going to be gone. I'm going to another job interview in Colorado. And so you'll still have to do stuff. I'm just moving that course online as well. I'll update the course calendar. I'll send another announcement. So you'll have that time. The week after that, I already did not plan to have class because it's ASC, our big field conference, and I'll be in San Francisco. So that week I will release, the optional unit on social movements. And I think it's pretty interesting. The reason I don't have it in the regular course progress is that I haven't found a way to make it fit with the natural progression of the course, but it is interesting and it is related in some form, so I have it up there. The next week, we'll talk about war and genocide. The week after that should be Thanksgiving. We'll have a review on Tuesday, and then you have extra time to complete your test because of the holiday. So, and then the week after that is working on your final. So we only have, a couple more meetings left in person. So do try to show up to those. I know it's getting close to the end of the semester and things are getting long and difficult, and I definitely understand that the weather's getting cold and miserable, but do try to come. I appreciate that you show up. So enjoy the rest of your day. I apologize that this is being posted late, but I'll see you guys when I see you. Please email me if you have any questions.